Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's information session about the University Integrated Seniors Village. I'm Dr. Kathy Bruce, acting VPRI at Trent University. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize that Trent is on the treaty and traditional territory of the Michi-Saagiig Anishinaabe. We're grateful to the elders, knowledge holders, and community members for their ongoing guidance and teaching. This week has been particularly beautiful on the land and along the river, and I'm personally very grateful. Miigwech. Today, I'm going to provide you with some background to the Seniors Village Plan at Trent University. In February this year, Trent's Board of Governors approved the Trent Lands and Nature Areas Plan. This plan lays out how Trent will fulfill its role as a learning institution, as a steward of the natural environment, and as a community anchor. The plan commits to preserving 60% of our lands as nature areas and green spaces, while also identifying locations suitable for campus and community infrastructure. The University Integrated Seniors Village is a key project that will deliver on the vision of the Trent Lands Plan. It's a project at the intersection of research strengths at Trent, critical community needs of seniors housing, and especially long-term care, and the need to grow the workforce involved in aging and seniors care. And I'd like to give you a bit of information about how this project came to the forefront of our planning. I would describe this as a combination of capacity and opportunity. The Trent Center for Aging and Society has become an international leader in interdisciplinary aging studies that promotes innovative research, education, and community engagement on aging and old age. And in fact, the Trent Center for Aging has just won an award for rural aging research, and one of the members of that center was also named as Distinguished Researcher this year. They're just moving along beautifully. Members of the center have been part of an international project that studied promising practices in long-term care. And discussions began a few years ago about how that learning can be put into practice in our community, especially knowing that Peterborough has one of the longest wait lists for long-term care homes. We have 2,500 people waiting 2 to 4 years for a care bed. In mid-2019, the province announced that it would be opening an application process for new long-term care beds. And at that point, members of Senior Admin and the Trent Center for Aging and Society undertook a study tour of long-term care homes and met with staff in the Ministry of Long-Term Care to discuss whether Trent could help meet this need in our community and advance promising practices. So this resulted in, first, a bid to collaborate on a long-term care home at Trent, and second, the selection of People Care as the builder and operator of the home. And then third, in March this year, we learned that our bid to bring not-for-profit home to Trent was successful. And I want to share with you a little bit of my excitement about the project in terms of research. As the Vice President, Research and Innovation, I want to take just a few moments to share my excitement. And I'm going to stick to 3 big points. I can go on for a long time, as some of you know, but I'll just stick to 3 points. The first is alignment and reciprocity. People Care and Trent are fully in alignment in terms of our research goals. People Care wants to partner with Trent because we are world-class leaders in research on aging, and we have the highest integrity in our research practices. And we want to partner with People Care because they're interested in best practice and innovation. In that way, we have a shared vision, and the work is mutually beneficial and reciprocal in that way for students, faculty, residents of the home, families, community, staff, and People Care. The second big point I wanted to raise around research is improvement by design. We know that good research leads to impact on policy and practice. We sometimes call this design research. And this approach involves cyclical and continual improvement. This kind of research happens on the ground, and it works in genuine ways, nitty-gritty problems, and looks at solutions to complex issues we face as a society, and in this case with aging, care, and long-term care. And the third research piece I wanted to note is that this is a sustainable research approach. I can't overstate this. With long-term relationships in research, We don't just jump in and try something and declare it works and walk away. With a long-term relationship like this, we can measure the impacts and practices and approaches to care and aging, and it leads to quality, resident-focused care and positive system change. So I'll stop there on those kinds of benefits around research, but I also wanted to speak to other kinds of benefits to the long-term care home and the Seniors Village plan. This project will provide employment and experiential learning opportunities for students across many programs, including nursing, social work, kinesiology, but also programs like business and sustainable agriculture and more. The project also responds to labor market shortages in the long-term care sector. We believe students will be attracted to employment in the field by having the opportunity to work in this home. In fact, this has been our experience with nursing students who have learned that working with elderly is, complex and socially rewarding simultaneously. And the project will support Trent's growing specializations in academic programs, such as credit courses, not for credit courses, certificates, including healthcare management, leadership in a long-term care sector, indigenous aging, gerontology, infection prevention and control. It also ties to kinesiology, the medical professional stream. There's a whole bunch of wonderful opportunities there. The home will, and for that, the home will include teaching space and an area for community partners to come together. I think that will be a very important kind of magnet point of convergence for people to come together and share and talk and think through practice and approaches. Practically speaking, this first step in the Seniors Village will bring 224 new long-term care beds to the region to help many individuals and families with the access and care that they need. The home will also include a specialized dementia care feature, and that's an area of particular need, it seems, in our region. So the broad vision of the University Integrated Seniors Village, anchored by the long-term care home, is to build an age-friendly, complete community that provides a range of housing options with an intergenerational learning and living environment. Research and teaching collaborations will underpin this broader initiative as well. So I wanted to start with those opening remarks, give you a little bit of background and a little bit about my excitement about this development. And I want to thank you for joining us today to learn more about this exciting and transformative project. And I'm going to turn the floor over to our moderator, Caitlin Allen now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for those opening remarks, and thank you to everyone for coming today. As just mentioned, my name is Caitlin Allen. I'm from a planning, urban design, and community engagement firm called Bousefields, and I'll be the moderator for the session today. So before we get into the next stages of the presentation, I just wanted to get into just cover a few housekeeping notes before we begin. So as you may have noticed, this session is being recorded. Certainly feel free to leave your cameras off if you'd prefer to remain unseen through the session. Participants are going to be muted during the presentation to cut down on background noise for everyone, but there will be opportunities to unmute at a later stage in the session. There will be time for a question and answer period at the end. So feel free to submit your questions using the chat feature during the presentation, or raise your hand once we get into the Q&A session, and we'll call upon you to be unmuted and ask your question. Throughout this session, we want to remind everyone to maintain respect for all presenters, as well as any of the other presenters that or participants that you hear from today. So first, in terms of an agenda for today, first there'll be a presentation about the environmental work that was foundational to creating this draft stage 1 site plan, which you're going to hear more about today. Followed by that, there's going to be a presentation focused on detailing what's going to be included in that draft stage 1 site plan and the approvals process required. We'll then look at talking about broad next steps on the project and then move into the question and answer period. We ask that you hold your questions until this Q&A period, but again, you're able to submit your questions into the chat throughout the presentation. So moving right along, I'd like to introduce to you Megan Rochon of GEI Savanta, who is the environmental consulting firm that's prepared an environmental impact brief, which will be submitted in support of the site plan application. So Megan, on to you.
Thanks, Caitlin. So we prepared an environmental impact brief to assess features on the property, and we'll be reviewing the results of that today, as well as measures that we've suggested through the Natural Heritage Compensation Plan to mitigate any potential impacts to the site. So Trent University engaged Savanta GEI to study and report on the natural environment in and surrounding the Trent lands where the seniors village and long-term care home were proposed. Our team completed an environmental impact brief to establish a preferred development envelope, which is shown in white on the figure, that would minimize impacts to the environment and allow us to achieve a net gain to the natural heritage system based on the objectives defined in the Trent Lands and Nature Areas Plan. The environmental impact brief was completed in place of an environmental impact study. Environmental impact studies are typically undertaken after the site plan has been developed to demonstrate that there won't be an impact as a result of the proposed site plan and to address the site-specific impacts related to that plan. At this stage, because a site plan hasn't been developed, we can't assess those specific impacts. So the environmental impact study was amended to an environmental impact brief that will instead function as a landscape-led approach to determining an appropriate development limit based on the potential constraints and opportunities that were identified on the property. This report is functioning as a pre-screening of the site to inform the development process based on the features present, and is not a standard practice that we typically see in development, but is something that has been requested and led through Trent's commitment to applying an environment first approach. That being said, an environmental impact study will be prepared during the later planning stages once that detailed site plan application has been developed. Our team also completed a natural heritage compensation plan to guide the mitigation and restoration strategies proposed for the site to ensure that these measures could be implemented to the satisfaction of Trent University, First Nations, the Ontonabe River Conservation Authority, and the City of Peterborough prior to development. Doing this prior to development gives us an opportunity to demonstrate that a net benefit to the natural heritage system can be achieved before impacts occur. The compensation plan also includes a comprehensive monitoring program to verify that the restoration strategies are having the intended effect and progressing along the planned trajectory. So as part of the environmental impact brief, we characterized existing natural heritage features and associated functions, identified significant features and species present, including valued I2K species. We assessed anticipated impacts as a result of the land use change to determine a preferred development limit and recommended mitigation and restoration strategies. So through early engagement between Trent, Savanta, and First Nations, the 3-season studies typically undertaken to assess natural heritage and features and functions were extended to cover a 4-season field program at the request of the First Nations community. Engaging the First Nations at this early stage in the process is a unique approach undertaken by Trent University that gives us a chance to adapt those studies to address First Nation concerns and priorities at the early stages of our work being completed. So this 4-season field program, North-South Environmental undertook the winter survey component, and then GEI Savanta was retained to undertake the remaining 3-season ecological inventory. This allowed us to focus on assessing and confirming the presence of species and habitats specific to this site that were identified through the preliminary field studies conducted by North-South, as well as through secondary data reviews, contributions from members of the campus and from the community. So through this early engagement with First Nations, we were able to adjust our ecological field investigations to target Indigenous traditional knowledge and species identified through consultation with First Nations. Through this process, 23 species of known significance were identified. These species were targeted through our ecological field investigations and afforded special consideration in the analysis of ecological and natural heritage significance, particularly in the Ontario Wetland Evaluation System assessment of wetland significance that was completed on the property. Our staff also invited First Nations representatives from each community to join staff on site during the ecological surveys to keep First Nations engaged. Unfortunately, they were unable to attend due to COVID safety precautions. At the later stages of reporting, First Nations communities engaged 4 directions of conservation consulting services to review and provide input into the environmental impact brief. This review was overall complementary of Trent's approach to identifying natural features, using the environment to inform the development limits, proactively engaging First Nations throughout the process, incorporating ITK, and of the thoroughness and detail provided within the studies. The First Nations have shared that this is an approach that they would recommend in the future, and the comments that were provided were used to inform the later compensation plan. Within that compensation plan, we've incorporated ITK species and considerations for where those species were located to inform the land use planning and design. Where possible, valued species have been identified and proposed to be incorporated into our restoration plans so that they can be retained on the landscape over the long term. So the area of study is shown here on the figure on the right. The parcels outlined in black are Trent assessment parcels 2C and 2D, and they're primarily composed of cultural communities. Cultural communities have a cultural legacy and have been influenced by human activities. These communities are typically characterized by low quality habitat, an abundance of invasive species and non-native species, a lack of diverse structure in the understory, and a lack of species diversity. Within the Total Lost Farms nature area, communities largely consisted of woodland and wetland areas with inclusions of marsh, swamp, and meadow habitats. So the wetlands identified on the property are highlighted in blue and were addressed as candidate provincially significant wetlands within the environmental impact brief. The final status of these features will be confirmed and verified with the Ministry of Natural Resources following the submission of the wetland evaluation report that was also completed by Savanta. We also identified natural woodland communities, which are shown in the dark green and consist of deciduous, coniferous, and mixed forests and swamps, as well as plantations and other woodlands, which were of horticultural origin and lacked that natural diversity and understory vegetation. We've also just expanded on our results here to review the significant wildlife habitat that was detected on the property. So significant wildlife habitat was evaluated based on the criteria defined within provincial guidelines, including the Natural Heritage Reference Manual, the Significant Wildlife Habitat Technical Guide, and the Eco-Regional Criteria Schedule. Within the northern portion of the property, groundwater seeps were identified within a coniferous swamp. And these areas will be protected within the nature area. In terms of amphibians, we had a full chorus of Western chorus frog recorded within the southern wetland, and greater than 20 amphibians were heard calling within the northern wetland, and those species included chorus frog, spring peeper, wood frog, and gray tree frog. These features were ultimately identified as woodland amphibian breeding habitat, SWH, significant wildlife habitat, and will be protected within the Trent nature area. No calling amphibians were detected at any other stations on the site, and chorus frogs were not detected in any other features on the property, despite targeted survey effort. We also identified candidate woodland area sensitive breeding bird habitat and habitat for species at risk bats within the natural treed communities on the property that are shown in teal. Possible breeding evidence for 2 area sensitive bird species was detected. And although this does not meet significant thresholds, we did designate these areas as candidate significant wildlife habitat as a precautionary measure, given the extent of the contiguous woodlands extending off-site to ensure that these features are protected. For endangered bat species, tricolored bat was identified during bat surveys. It's expected that bat species on the property are primarily using areas within the development block as foraging habitat, so that area shown in white, while roosting habitats, which are the critical habitat for the species, were identified in the natural woodlands highlighted in teal. We have recommended actions to provide an overall benefit to local bat populations by planting more nectaring species to expand nature areas to attract insect populations and increase bat foraging habitat, as well as recommended planting of native tree species that will increase the availability of suitable roosting sites over the long term. Both of these habitat types will be protected within the Trent nature area as well. We also have areas highlighted in pink, which identify confirmed habitat for eastern wood pewee and wood thrush. So the polygon in the northern portion of the site was identified as eastern wood pewee habitat, and it occurs within a continuous woodland that extends off-site. Eastern wood pewee is known to inhabit coniferous mixed and deciduous stands, and habitat for eastern wood pewee is similar to the habitat occupied by wood thrush, so this habitat is expected to be suitable for this species as well. Confirmed wood thrush habitat was identified within the woodland community east of Water Street. This area occurs outside of the proposed area of impact and will be retained over the long term. We did also identify 1 wood thrush within the central cultural plantation in the area highlighted in white. This observation was considered to be incidental. The plantation itself is not considered to be a key area in supporting wood thrush habitat, as preferred habitat consists of mature deciduous woodlands and mixed woodland communities that are characterized by dense and well-developed undergrowth, leaf litter, and tall trees. By contrast, the cultural plantations are horticultural in nature and lack natural diversity and understory vegetation favored by the species. So both of the breeding territories highlighted in pink will be retained within the Trent nature areas to ensure that this habitat is protected over the long term. Monarch was also identified on the site. This species is ranked special concern in Ontario and was identified as a valued ITK species. Candidate monarch habitat was sporadically present within the cultural meadow and the cultural savanna communities on the property, where we detected occasional to rare occurrences of common milkweed throughout. Common milkweed is a host plant for monarch and is an indicator of monarch habitat. It hasn't been mapped on the figure to the right because the dispersal of plants was very sporadic, and we only observed a single monarch during all of the surveys completed on the property, so we weren't able to highlight a defined habitat area. This does, however, highlight an opportunity for us to enhance habitat for monarch on the property by planting more common milkweed to attract monarchs and to expand the habitat area within the Trent nature area. So overall, with the exception of small satellite populations of common milkweed, no significant wildlife habitat is located within the proposed development limit, which is shown in the white. Based on the results of the surveys that were conducted on the property, we completed a preliminary constraints analysis to identify a preliminary alternative for development. So we identified 4 potential development parcels totaling 6.67 hectares within open areas where we had limited natural heritage features and a low degree of constraint. Although development within low constraint areas would minimize the removal of natural heritage features, multiple small development blocks would not be the most effective approach for development, both from a community design perspective and an ecological perspective. Potential impacts to retained features are expected to be greater where we have multiple small development blocks that disperse development impacts and create long, narrow patches of natural habitat. So because of this, we proposed a revised development boundary that's been identified as the preferred alternative that will largely consolidate the proposed development area in order to retain a cohesive natural heritage block. So the preferred alternative is shown here. From an ecological perspective, multiple development blocks as well as roadway crossings through retained features would be expected to have a greater impact on retained natural areas than the consolidated development area. Generally, large patches of natural areas contribute greater biodiversity and more effectively support the habitat of area-sensitive species by protecting interior habitat areas and providing opportunities for wildlife movement throughout the landscape. Natural area blocks are also more likely to contain intact internal ecosystem functions and conditions to support various life stages of the different wildlife on the property. The recommended development limit was designed to avoid high and medium constraint areas, such as the wetlands on the property and the natural woodland features. Avoidance of these key areas is preferred, so therefore these areas will be retained within the Trent Nature Area. Based on environmental studies and engagement with First Nations, the recommended development limits have been concentrated along Woodland Drive and Water Street. This is optimal in terms of impacts to the natural environment, as these areas are already disturbed adjacent to the roadways, and it provides an easy access point to the developable area. Through this configuration of the design, it's allowed Trent to ensure that more than 2/3 of the property will remain natural and undeveloped within the Trent Nature Area. The recommendation is to increase the total nature area and designate these as a protected area to ensure that a variety of habitats and common species, as well as species at risk, are protected on the property. The large wetlands that you see identified have been fully incorporated into the Trent Nature Area with appropriate buffers, and the proposed development limit has also been designed to reduce the total interface of the wetlands with the adjacent development blocks to further reduce potential impacts to these features. So we'll just go through an overview of the benefits of the preferred alternative. So under the preferred alternative, which is located on the right, the developable area shown is 7.86 hectares. This is considerably less than the developable area that was designated through the Trent Lands Plan, which was 17 hectares. Although it's more than the 6.7 hectare area shown on the preliminary alternative, the 6.7 hectare area doesn't consider the road crossings and infrastructure that would be required to connect these development blocks. So overall, the area of impact would actually be quite a bit larger than this. In terms of the interface between development and natural areas, the preliminary alternative was interfacing with natural habitats over 2,338 meters, while under the preferred alternative, that's reduced to 1,313 meters. This is important in terms of edge effects and potential impacts extending from developable areas into adjacent features. So by reducing the interface with natural areas, we're able to ensure that impacts are reduced over the long term. As I mentioned as well, the preferred alternative gives us the opportunity to remove the roadway connections that would be required between the different development blocks so that the retained features aren't disturbed by further infrastructure development. And then in terms of the area of the total Lost Farms nature area, under the preliminary alternative, that nature area was 13.23 hectares as defined in the Trent Lands Plan. whereas the preferred alternative gives us the opportunity to extend this area to 22.6 hectares. It also gives us the opportunity to expand the linkage corridor within the Trent Nature Area from 57 meters, which is relatively narrow, to 161 meters. This is beneficial in terms of wildlife movement across the landscape and also connects wildlife to important features such as the wetlands and watercourses, where we would expect these species to naturally congregate. And then, as I mentioned, the preferred alternative will also reduce the interface between development boundaries and wetlands. So under the preliminary alternative, we see 1,188 meters of development adjacent to wetland areas, while under the preferred alternative, this is reduced to 487 meters, so a considerable difference. Then I'll just get into a review of the compensation plan that was prepared to accompany the environmental impact brief. So restoration objectives were defined through the compensation plan that will provide a net benefit to the natural heritage system over the long term. Restoration will commence before or in tandem with any activities on site. Implementing the proposed plan ahead of development will ensure that we can develop more robust habitats prior to the land use change to ensure that these habitats are available to wildlife and are also more tolerant of changes on the landscape. Overall, the compensation plan has been designed to enhance the ecological form and function of existing habitats by contributing biologically and structurally diverse woodland and meadow habitat features to the existing communities. The enhanced woodlands and surrounding communities are expected to promote improved wildlife habitat functions and movement across the landscape to ensure that natural sustaining habitats persist on the landscape over the long term. So in terms of what that looks like, we've outlined the target restoration areas on the plan shown here. Reforestation efforts will target the establishment of diverse and successional woodland communities. The community types that were selected reflect the form and function of existing natural woodlands that occur within the Trent Nature Area. They have incorporated valued ITK species, and they've been selected based on their ability to support wood thrush habitat, eastern wood kiwi habitat, and bat habitat over the long term. The first treatment area is a white birch poplar coniferous mixed forest shown in red. This area is generally proposed in edge habitats that are located within 10 meters of the limit of development or boundary of the site. The proposed community is a mix of fast growing and pioneer species that develop quickly and are more tolerant of variable growing conditions, so they're well suited to edge habitats. This will allow these areas to establish more quickly to protect the interior communities that are being proposed on the site. We've also proposed a sugar maple ironwood deciduous forest treatment area that's shown in teal here. This area has been designed to replicate the communities associated with suitable eastern wood kiwi and wood thrush habitat within the northern Trent Nature Area. As this community develops, it's expected that it will expand the suitable habitat area for these species and ensure that they're able to persist over the long term. We've also identified a white cedar coniferous forest and poplar deciduous forest treatment area shown in blue in the northern portion of the property. This area will extend existing habitat types that were identified in this location to form a more contiguous woodland block. So the selected community types are already well suited to the existing and future conditions of the site and will provide habitat for the woodland species that were identified, as well as thermal mitigation and organic inputs into the adjacent wetland. For areas adjacent to the candidate provincially significant wetlands, we are proposing planting of oak, maple, hickory deciduous forest that will support the riparian habitat where buffer functions may currently be limited. The proposed plantings will contribute organic material to the wetlands and watercourse, as well as provide thermal mitigation, improve foraging opportunities for birds and bats, and attract local insect populations. So within each of the woodland treatment areas, replantings will be implemented at a density of 1,500 trees per hectare to achieve a productive forest based on the guidelines provided within the City of Peterborough Woodland Conservation Bylaw. Complementary native seed mixes will also be applied throughout the treatment areas that will contain plant species to support the growth of the target communities, as well as contain nectaring plant species to support pollinator populations and foraging opportunities for species like the monarch. We have also proposed passive restoration sites where warm season native grass communities have been identified as the preferred community type. These communities will consist of competitive native herbaceous species and prairie species that will inhibit pioneer tree growth in order to maintain open habitats for insect species such as monarch over the long term. These areas will be enhanced with plantings of nectaring species and common milkweed to provide a greater diversity of habitat functions. Following implementation of these habitat types, performance monitoring will be completed within each treatment area over the course of a 5-year monitoring period. The performance monitoring will function on the functionality of the restoration area and system performance to confirm that compensation efforts have had the intended effect and are moving towards restoration objectives. If these objectives are not being met, adjustments will be made through adaptive management strategies that will be developed as the program progresses. So in summary, the overall compensation plan will provide 4.52 hectares of woodland compensation, 2.16 hectares of prairie meadow habitat, as well as an additional 0.91 hectares of reforestation within ecological offsetting areas that have been proposed on additional lands owned by Trent University outside of this property. This approach has been taken to ensure that we can achieve an ecological gain by increasing the total replication area from a 1-to-1 replication ratio, which is what's required under the woodland conservation area, to a 1.5-to-1 replication ratio. Overall, it's expected that this will help to enhance habitat complexity within the Trent nature area, improve foraging opportunities, and support terrestrial and aquatic linkages. Thanks, everyone, and we look forward to answering any questions that you might have.
Great. Thanks so much, Megan, for that presentation and going through those details. I next want to introduce the second presenter this evening. Emma West is a partner at Bousefields, and she will be getting into the details with regards to the Stage 1 site plan application and provide an overview with regards to the planning approval process. So Emma, on to you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. Our presentation part is going to be finished in just a few moments, but I want to explain to you the planning policy context and what the actual application is going to be. So as you heard, the site is located at the north end of the city at Water and Woodland. You've heard GEI Savanta's overview of their work on the environmental areas. You also heard Trent's vision for the developable portions of the land, which are focused on a university integrated seniors village, which will provide a long-term care home and meet the needs of the community, support the university and the students, and contribute to a complete community. It brings together the university and the community in many great ways. The process, as you've heard, is a nature first approach, and it's consistent with the policies and plans of the city, but also Trent. And I'm sure many of you have participated in the consultation around the Trent lands and nature areas plan. So you may be familiar with the idea of the seniors village in this area. So one of the first things we do when we are starting to look at a site and considering it for development is we need to look at the city's official plan and the zoning bylaw. So to understand those policies and where to start, we look at the land use schedule within the official plan. So on the left side of your screen, you see the land use schedule that's for the whole city. In the middle of the screen, you see a zoomed in version with the outline of the property in red. You can see then that the site is, for the most part, designated major institution and major open space area up in the northwest corner where you see the green. There's also a portion that is natural areas. Also in the official plan, it identifies Water Street and Woodland Drive as high capacity arterial roads. And you'll know that there's existing transit in the area, in the broader surroundings, and including the new Link transit service that runs adjacent to the site on Water Street. That's really important to think about in terms of connections from the site to the surroundings as well. So when we look at the zoning, you can see on this schedule, again, on the left side, it's the full zoning schedule for this portion of the city. On the right side, it's a zoomed in version, and there are two small letters in that zoomed in outlined area that say UC, so that's the University and College District Zone. So together with the designation of major institution and the zoning of University College District, these permit uses associated with the university. And because the long-term care and seniors village will be integrated with the university with research and teaching opportunities, for example, the uses would be permitted and would contribute to a complete community and support the other policies in the city's official plan and provincial policies in that regard, specifically related to complete communities. One other thing I want to highlight for you is the way people move in this area. And those of you who are familiar with the Trent Lands Plan would know that there was a mobility network identified in that. The city also identifies where major roads are and transportation is, and I've just described a few of those. But it's important to emphasize that this area takes great advantage of the transit that is in the area. And this proposal in particular will support that transit and will be supported by the transit. Access to transit, the surrounding area, the integration with the university makes this site an important site and a good site for development for the seniors village and the long-term care. And particularly when you consider the context for the people who will be here in the future, the people who would be living here and working here, that access to transit and ways to walk around and ways to connect into nature, but also into the surrounding uses, that's an important part of a complete community. So now to what we're here to talk to you about specifically this evening. So the application that will be going to the city is a stage 1 site plan. Now, site plan applications like this are a little bit unique because what you would typically have in a site plan application is a definition of the boundaries of development. So you've already seen that Savanta has done a considerable amount of work to define the limits of the environmental areas. You would see where the natural features are to be protected. So you've seen that as well. But in a typical site plan application, you would have the location of buildings, specific buildings that would be proposed, their height, their form, where they sit on the site. There would be landscaping. There would be a traffic study, the way that the cars are going to get in and out of the site, pedestrian access would be shown on a plan, drainage, parking lots, and how it fits within, all of that fits within the context of the site. So Trent is not yet at a stage in the process where they have all of that detailed information. And so in order to continue through a process, because for Trent, it's really important for them to be working with partners who would understand how much developable area there is on the site versus how much is going to be protected, so that they can consider their options on how to develop the site in the future. It's really important to have these limits of development defined now. Because of that, Trent will be submitting a stage 1 site plan application in which the limits of development, the boundaries of open space, including natural and cultural features, are identified. And as I've described, that stage 1 site plan will not include proposals for any buildings at this time. If approved, the stage 1 site plan will allow the university to initiate the site preparation process and associated approvals for the restoration that you've heard described and removal of vegetation that isn't significant, to start their visioning and design work with people care, and to engage in a visioning exercise for the seniors village. So the drawing that we've all been waiting for, the actual stage 1 site plan drawing. You can see the areas in green are the open space areas that you saw on the Savanta drawings. It's simplified for the site plan drawing because all of that is just to identify that those green areas are the areas that will be outside of the development area. The gray areas are the areas that would be developed. Again, at this point, we don't know the detail of where buildings and parking and all of the landscape would be located, but we're just defining those two things, the open space area in the green and the development area in the gray. And as you've heard, this means that of the 30 hectares of the site, there's more than 2/3 of it that would be protected in that green area. So what happens now? So the stage 1 site plan, as you've seen, we've been doing quite a bit of work on that. We're here to hear your comments this evening, but we also want to provide you with an opportunity to submit comments until May 30th. The stage 1 site plan application will be submitted to the city in June. And then the city will undertake their typical review process for an application, which includes providing feedback, perhaps requesting changes and approval of the application. But that will be through the city's process and through their timelines. Certainly the university wants to make the application before the summer break so that it can be considered as soon as possible so as to not delay the long-term care home. And keeping in mind that in the future, there will be a stage 2 site plan application. But in advance of that, the university will start a visioning exercise for the long-term care home and the seniors village later this year in the summer or fall. And that will include looking at where the location of higher intensity uses would be, determining the interface with the natural features, designing green spaces within the development block, and all of that in a nature inclusive design approach. So the studies for that stage 2, more detailed site plan process would be worked on once the vision has been developed, and the university is planning for a submission in 2022, so next year. So that's the end of my presentation, and we're looking forward to your questions. Thank you.